Hey guys, what's up? It's Savannah. Welcome back to my channel. And today we are talking about one of the biggest serial killers in the United States, and that is Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer has been a video that you guys have been requesting for such a long time. He is always the most top liked comment in my comment section whenever I post a true crime video. So I'm really excited to be sitting down and doing this for you guys today, and I hope you enjoy this. So Jeffrey Dahmer is a United States serial killer whose nicknames also included the Milwaukee Cannibal and the Milwaukee Monster. He was born on May 21st of 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His parents' names were Joyce and Lionel, and he was the oldest of two boys. His childhood wasn't the smoothest. Jeffrey witnessed his parents argue all the time, and his house was constantly filled with yelling and screaming and just disagreements left and right, and just a lot of tension in that household. But as he grew older into his teenage years, he started to distance himself from his friends and his family, and also distance himself from the things that kids his age liked to do. He was very much an independent individual. So Jeffrey really enjoyed hobbies that a lot of kids and a lot of people in general don't really have. Starting from a young age, he really enjoyed finding dead animals, whether that was roadkill or whether that was finding a dead animal and taking it with him into this shed that he had in his backyard in his family house. And he would examine the dead body, kind of take it apart and look into it and put it in glass jars. Jeffrey's father, Lionel, said that his son's fascination with dead animals and bones came from when the family had first moved into the house they were living in, and Jeffrey's dad had to go underneath the house and sweep it up, and there were animal bones underneath the house. And Lionel said that once Jeffrey saw those dead bones, he was completely fascinated, and that's what kind of grew this infatuation for him. Lionel said that Jeffrey became thrilled by the sound that the bones would make, and that's when his collection and fascination of animal bones started. In October 1966, Jeffrey and his family packed up and moved to Ohio. So moving into more of Jeffrey's teenage years, he was definitely the outcast among his friends. He really didn't fit in, and this is when Jeffrey's drinking habits really started. Jeffrey's classmates say that they remember him bringing hard liquor and beer to school and just drinking it and keeping it in his jacket. Jeffrey referred to the alcohol as his medicine. His friends would ask him why he was drinking at school, why he was drinking throughout the day, and Jeffrey would just say that the alcohol was his medicine. Jeffrey's grades were not the best in school. They were okay, but they weren't great considering the fact that he was drunk throughout his days at school. He was a part of the tennis team at school, and he was pretty good at that. He also was in the school band and seemed to really enjoy that. And over time, Jeffrey kind of developed the stereotype in a sense of being the class clown. He would always pull pranks to attract attention from his classmates and make everyone laugh and make him the center of attention. It even became a thing where his classmates would call it doing a Dahmer, because that's what Jeffrey did. They would tell him do a Dahmer, and he would go out and do some crazy obscure thing in order to attract attention to himself. In 1977 is when things really started to kind of go downhill. Jeffrey's parents did end up getting a divorce this year, and Jeffrey's grades really started to slip, as well as his alcohol intake really started to go up. So the combination of all of those things combined obviously was not a good thing. Even though the divorce of his parents wasn't a surprise, it obviously wasn't a fun thing for any child to go through, and because he felt like he was being so neglected in his family life, he really turned to alcohol and these doing a Dahmer things in order to attract the attention that he was lacking at his home. Throughout Jeffrey's teenage years, he always felt a little bit different from his friends, in the sense that all of his friends, all of his guy friends, were dating girls and taking girls out and hooking up with girls, and Jeffrey simply didn't like girls that way. Jeffrey realized that he wasn't having these fantasies about girls, but he was actually having fantasies about guys. It was just not talked about and not really accepted back when this was all happening. So Jeffrey kind of suppressed these feelings as much as he could and tried to kind of hide them, but in the back of his mind, he knew that he liked boys the way his other friends liked girls. Jeffrey committed his first murder in June of 1978. After his parents had divorced, his mother had moved out of town and his father had moved into a motel, so Jeffrey was at the house a lot by himself. One day, Jeffrey was driving around town. He noticed a hitchhiker and pulled over to the side of the road and told the hitchhiker to get in and that he could take him for a ride, but they could also go back to his place and party for a little bit and drink. And the hitchhiker agreed, so he got into the car and they drove away. This hitchhiker's name was Stephen Hicks, who was almost 19 years old when this happened. Jeffrey and Stephen Hicks went back to Jeffrey's house and they both started drinking, and in the back of Jeffrey's mind, he knew that he wanted to have sex with Stephen. So the two of them went back to Jeffrey's house and they started to drink and listen to music, and after a little while, Stephen decided that he wanted to leave and he wanted to go back to wherever he was originally supposed to go, and Jeffrey was not okay with that and he did not want that to happen. Stephen. That is when Jeffrey hit Stephen over the head with a 10-pound barbell. Jeffrey hit Stephen twice behind his head, and that is when Stephen became unconscious. Jeffrey then took the bar part of the barbell and began to strangle Stephen with it. He then did very disturbing things to Stephen's body. After he murdered Stephen, he then decided that he needed to get rid of the body, so he decided to cut him up. He dismembered Stephen's body and buried him in his backyard. Several weeks after his first murder, he then went back to Stephen's body where he had buried it, and he decided he needed to get rid of all evidence, so he took the flesh off of Stephen's body and put it into acid and then poured the solution down the toilet. He then crushed Stephen's bones with a sledgehammer and kind of dissolved them all over the area of where his shed was in his backyard. So after the first murder of Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey's father as well as his new fiance decided to move back into the house with Jeffrey. Lionel had a gut instinct that things with his son were not right and something was really off with him. And he really thought that Jeffrey just needed help to get back on the right track with things. So that is what he tried to do. Lionel went with Jeffrey to different AA meetings, which are Alcohol Anonymous meetings, as well as going to therapy with him. But even throughout all of that, nothing was working, and Jeffrey actually enrolled into Ohio State University, and he dropped out after 3 months because he had a 0.45 GPA. His terrible GPA was just a result of all the alcohol he was drinking and just all the recklessness that was happening in his lives. He did not care about school at all, and he just didn't have his priorities straight. After dropping out of Ohio State, he decided that he was going to enlist in the Army, so he signed up for the Army for 6 years, but he was actually discharged after only 2 years because of his excessive alcohol use. Right after leaving the Army, he decided he was going to move to Miami, Florida, and he didn't tell anyone in his family about this. He just went from Army to Miami, and that is where he stayed for a little bit of time. He started sleeping in a motel and working at a sandwich shop, but the expenses of the motel were starting to add up, and he called his father to ask him for money, and Lionel told him that he wasn't going to give him any money, but he was going to give him a plane ticket to come home and try to get his life straight again. Jeffrey took this offer immediately and came home and decided to move in with his grandmother. His grandmother lived at the time in West Allis, Wisconsin, and at first the accommodation of his grandmother and Jeffrey living together was turning out to work really well. Jeffrey and her would go to church together, Jeffrey would do chores around the house, he was really respectful of his grandmother, he was actively looking for a job, and he actually stopped drinking for a little while. So it was a huge major turnaround from what he was doing in his actions a couple years prior. But keep in mind, I know you probably didn't forget it, but he still did murder someone at this point. It wasn't like he was this amazing person. He had still committed a horrible, horrible crime. But no one around him knew that, and people were really starting to think that his life was getting changed for the better and he was getting back on the right track where he needed to be. So while Jeffrey was staying at his grandmother's house, although his behavior initially started to seem really great, he was also suppressing all of these feelings that he had in his love life. But one night while he was at the library, there was a man who had passed him a note, and this man who gave Jeffrey this note was basically offering Jeffrey sex, and Jeffrey declined this immediately. But even though Jeffrey declined this note, this is when those feelings that he had that he was trying to push down, his attraction to men, really started to come up again. Jeffrey started experimenting by going to different bars and bathhouses, and before his murders really started, he would go to these bathhouses, and while he was there, he would actually slip something in the man's drink that he was with, and this happened on multiple different occasions. That way the man would pass out. Basically it was kind of like a date rape drug, and he would be able to do basically whatever he wanted with them, and then they would wake up and Jeffrey would be gone. And that was kind of his MO in the beginning. Like, that's what he would do. He would go to these bars and these bathhouses and drug men. Jeffrey's second victim was a man named Stephen Twomey. Stephen and Jeffrey met at a bar called 219 in November of 1987, so a couple years after the Stephen Hicks murder. At these bars, Jeffrey was actually known to be a really charming guy and someone who you wanted to take care of and who was really nice and was really attractive. And Jeffrey had this personality that kind of lured him into you, and so it was easy for these guys to end up really liking Jeffrey really quickly. Stephen and Jeffrey got to talking, and Jeffrey actually convinced Stephen to go back to his hotel room with him, and Stephen said okay, and the two of them went. And Jeffrey says the last thing he remembers about this is waking up the next morning, noticing his hand was all beaten and bruised, and seeing Stephen Twomey's body lying underneath the bed. So Jeffrey states that in this murder in particular, he completely blacked out and does not remember a single thing. He said that his intention was to slip a pill in his drink, drug him, and rape him, but his intention was never to kill him. And so when he woke up the next day and saw that his hand was beaten and bruised and Stephen Twomey was lying dead on the floor, it really shocked him because that's not what he was expecting at all. Not saying it's any better than what he was originally planning on doing, but according to Jeffrey that was not his plan. He says that he has no memory of killing Steven, but Jeffrey decided he needed to do something with the body, so he went out and bought the biggest suitcase he could find, brought it back to his hotel room, and put the body of Steven into it and took it back to his grandmother's house. This is when Jeffrey says that his obsession with killing really started. Like, this was the murder that really kicked off everything. Brought the body down to his grandmother's basement and dismembered it. He decapitated Steven's head and tried to wrap it in a blanket to preserve it, but that was obviously unsuccessful and he had to dispose of it. Something about Jeffrey and his killings is that he liked to keep body parts of the people that he killed as some sort of trophy in a way. Dismembering the body and keeping certain parts of the people that he had murdered, it was a sense of accomplishment to him. Not too long after the murder of Stephen Twomey, Jeffrey met a 14-year-old boy outside of a bar who was waiting for the bus. This boy's name was James Dater. James was outside of this bar waiting for the bus, and that's when Jeffrey approached him and offered $50 to James if he would spend the night with Jeffrey. James agreed, and the two of them took the bus back to Jeffrey's grandmother's house. Jeffrey and James had some sort of physical interaction. I don't think they actually had sex, but they definitely had some sort of physical interaction between the two of them, and then that's when Jeffrey drugged James and strangled him to death. And something different about this murder in relation to all of Jeffrey's other murders, Jeffrey, instead of immediately disposing of the body like he did prior, decided that he wanted to keep this one for as long as he could, so he kept James's decomposing body in the basement for 2 weeks. Jeffrey was a necrophiliac, so you can only imagine the things that he was doing to these bodies after he murdered them. So after 2 weeks, Jeffrey disposed of the body and no one knew a thing. Something also to note about Jeffrey and his drinking and his murders is that Jeffrey would drink the most when he was about to commit a murder, and once the murder was actually committed, he would be blackout drunk and wouldn't remember a thing. So a lot of the interviews and the documentaries that I watched about Jeffrey Dahmer is because I immediately, when I first was reading about Jeffrey Dahmer, was like immediately like, he's a sociopath, he's a psychopath. No one who does this is right in his mind, and while he does have something completely off in his brain, people are saying that there is no way he's actually a sociopath, because sociopaths don't know the difference between right and wrong. They have no empathy, but Jeffrey knew the difference between right and wrong, and he would use alcohol as his escape to not remember and not to have such a heavy conscience about what he was doing. So that's something I found really interesting and just wanted to point out, because I completely labeled him as a sociopath from day one, and while there is something still completely not right about his brain, a lot of people don't believe that he was actually considered insane or a sociopath because he would drink so heavily to black out in order to commit these crimes. So 2 years after murdering James, Jeffrey met a man named Richard Guerrero at a bar. Similar to James, Jeffrey offered Richard money to spend the night with him, and Richard agreed. The two of them went back to Jeffrey's grandmother's house, and again, Jeffrey drugged and strangled Richard to death. A little while later, he dismembered the body, and this time he put it in trash cans for the garbage collectors to pick up the next day. What I find so crazy is, like, if those garbage collectors would have looked or like seen, Jeffrey would have been stopped right then and there, but he wasn't, and the garbage collector just picked up the trash and moved on, and no one ever suspected a thing. But this is when Jeffrey's grandmother asked him to move out. She said she was really displeased with how he was acting. She said he was coming home way too late, he was being way too loud when he was there, he was drinking heavily again. She also noted to Jeffrey about the weird smell coming from her basement, and Jeffrey didn't have an explanation, obviously, because he was not going to say, I've been murdering people down there. So that is when Jeffrey packed up all of his things and moved to an apartment on the west side of Milwaukee. Soon after Jeffrey moved into his apartment, he met a 13-year-old boy wandering near the sidewalk of where he lived, and he was able to lure the 13-year-old boy into his apartment. Luckily enough, though, this boy went into the apartment with Jeffrey. While the boy was in the apartment, though, Jeffrey did try to fondle him, and that is when he got scared and ran away, so a police report was filed, and Jeffrey was charged with second-degree sexual assault. He was not charged or looked into or investigated for any of the murders, just the assault, and he was sentenced to 1 year in prison. 10 days before his prison sentence began, he met a man named Anthony Sears and murdered him as well. Him and Anthony met at a bar, and they went back to Jeffrey's apartment, and that is when he drugged and strangled him. As I'm sure you guys are able to pick up at this point, Jeffrey has a very exact, precise way that he likes to do things. His MO is very spot on each time. When Jeffrey's sentencing started, he was also involved in a work release program, and towards the end of his work release term, Lionel, Jeffrey's father, actually wrote into the judge and asked him to help Jeffrey, to put him in some sort of rehab facilitation for drinking or just some sort of anything that could help him, and the judge declined this offer, and Jeffrey Jeffrey was released after only 10 months in prison. He then moved again to another apartment complex that was closer to the local bars in his area. 3 weeks after his release of prison, Jeffrey went on a killing frenzy. And something to note also prior to his jail time was that Jeffrey really didn't have a type. That was his ideal victim, but as far as hair color, skin color, eye color, that really didn't matter to Jeffrey. But ever since he got out of prison, Jeffrey got a lot more picky with his victims, and he mainly went after African American men. 3 weeks after his release is when he started his killings again, and in that specific year, he killed 13 men in 1 year. What I'm about to tell you makes me so frustrated because this was the perfect opportunity that Jeffrey could have been caught way sooner than when he actually was. And I try to be unbiased when I tell you guys these true crime stories, but sometimes it just really gets to me, and this one really did. So there was a 14-year-old boy named Conorak who Jeffrey had met and lured him back to his apartment. I couldn't figure out if Jeffrey had drugged Conorak yet or if he had just fallen asleep at Jeffrey's apartment, but Jeffrey did something very different this time that he had never done before, and that was while Conorak was sleeping, Jeffrey got up to go to the liquor store to buy more alcohol. And while he was gone, Conorak woke up and became completely terrified and decided to run out of Jeffrey's house. He had no clothes on, no anything, and he was just running through the streets trying to get away as fast as he could. There was a neighbor who saw this and immediately called 911 and said that there was a man with no clothes on running through the streets. So the police showed up to the scene, and while the police were pulling up is when Jeffrey actually arrived back to his apartment, and Jeffrey convinced the police that Conorak was his boyfriend and that he had just had too much to drink that night and that everything was fine. Jeffrey even invited the police into his apartment, and the police believed him and left. Jeffrey ended up murdering Conorak that night. The police say that they thought that Conorak was older than 14. They said that they believed he was of legal age, so that's why they didn't do anything to stop it, but that just infuriated me. After murdering so many people, the bodies of Jeffrey's victims really started to pile up in his apartment, and he decided that he needed to find a way to dispose of them properly. Jeffrey went out and purchased a 57-gallon drum, so like a 57-gallon tank essentially, and put the bodies in there. He filled this tank up with acid and then disposed of the bodies in the tank. Jeffrey dismembered all of his victims, so he would only put the torsos of the men he had murdered into the drum. He also cooked the skin of some of his victims on the stove. Neighbors started to notice that there was a very weird smell coming from Jeffrey's apartment, and his neighbors also noticed that Jeffrey never came home with groceries. He never brought food back to his house, and it was enough for them to question what is he possibly cooking if he never brings home any groceries. Along with being a necrophiliac, Jeffrey was also a cannibal, and that is where he got his Milwaukee Cannibal Killer name. Jeffrey had major abandonment issues growing up. His mother and father both left him at different times. Even though his father came back, his mother had deep issues, and she just kind of went off the map a little bit. And he had this thought in his brain that even though he had murdered these victims, he still didn't want them to leave him, essentially. And so in order to not make that happen, Jeffrey decided that the most logical thing to do at that point would be to eat his victims. This all started when Jeffrey was trying to preserve the bodies for as long as he could because he didn't want them to leave him and feel that abandonment feeling again. So he would try to preserve the bodies for as long as possible, but when he figured out that that wasn't working is when he inherited all these cannibalistic traits and decided the best thing to do would be to eat his victims. In 1991, there was a man named Tracy Edwards, and Tracy and Jeffrey had met. Jeffrey convinced him to go back to his apartment with him to spend the night with him. Once him and Tracy got into the apartment, Tracy noticed that something was not right and just got this gut instinct feeling that he needed to get out of the apartment right away. Luckily, Tracy was able to escape the apartment, and while he was running down the street, he noticed a cop car driving by. That's when he waved the car down and told him about Jeffrey and told him that he felt that something was really wrong. The police officer called for backup, and when the police went in, they had never seen anything like this before. When they went into Jeffrey's apartment, they noticed 83 Polaroid pictures of the dismembered body parts that Jeffrey had taken apart off of his victims. When the officer opened the refrigerator, he found 4 decapitated heads in the freezer. They also found pots and pans in his apartment filled with the dismembered body parts of his victims, as well as the torsos that were in that giant drum that I had mentioned prior. A lot of these officers got sick to their stomach after seeing all of this, and Jeffrey was immediately taken into the police station and arrested. Jeffrey immediately blamed his problems on his alcohol addiction and said that if he wasn't so drunk, he would have never been caught. In In total, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 men. The police spent 6 weeks getting a confession out of Jeffrey, which ended up being 157 pages long. The police decided to go back to his childhood home where he lived with his family before they divorced, and that's where they were able to find the remains of Stephen Hicks. So during the trial, Jeffrey pleaded guilty, but he also pleaded insanity. According to Jeffrey's attorney, Jeffrey said that in his mind he thought that he was the devil and that he was pure evil, but this all goes back to what I was saying prior about Jeffrey not being labeled as a sociopath, because he did have these empathetic traits that a sociopath would not have. Everyone expected Jeffrey to plead insanity, because how do you not plead insanity in something like this? Lionel, Jeffrey's father, sat through the entire trial in disbelief that his son was capable of such murders. I watched an interview with Lionel. Personally, I was kind of thinking, like, how do you not notice that something is this wrong with your son? However, on the other hand, I understood where he was coming from. Lionel would see Jeffrey every so often, and Jeffrey was a charmer. Like I said, he knew how to charm people and kind of knew how to manipulate people into thinking that everything was okay. That's what he did every single time when he would bring these men back to his home and kill them. So trying to put on this act of everything's okay, I'm a normal guy, really wasn't that hard for him. The jury had found Jeffrey Dahmer to be legally sane, and he was sentenced to 937 years in prison. While he was in prison, he decided he wanted to change his life around, and he decided he wanted to get baptized. So in 1994, he was baptized, and according to his father, he noticed that Jeffrey was actually starting to become more of a human and more normal. His father said that he noticed Jeffrey humanizing again, and so not that that matters at all because he just killed 17 men, but according to his father, he was trying to get his life straightened out again. During this trial, Jeffrey spoke and said that he felt very sorry for the crimes that he had committed and wished he never did them, and if he was able to take it all back, he would. November 29th, 1994, Jeffrey was in the prison gym, and that is when a man came up to him and stabbed him, and Jeffrey died in the prison hospital that same day. And I want to know what you think about this entire case. I know it's not one that has theories because we know exactly what happened, but I want to know what you think. So let me know in the comments below. And that is the end of this video, you guys. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up, as well as hit that subscribe button wherever it is, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye, guys.